Okay, I think we're there. Bill is coming. We have had, hi Val. We have had quite the adventure in our studio. I'm covered in sawdust. I've been laying flooring today. It's been kind of chaotic. Can you center?
Yes, I can center myself.
Center yours. No, it's the center that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we seem to be backwards there.
There we
go. So I'll come over there. So, but we've stopped the circular saw for the time being.
Yes.
And
we're both tired.
Yes.
But we're putting the studio back together so we can make some quilts.
Yeah, we had a pipe leak a couple of months ago when we've been basically working in the construction area for several months now. It's been not a lot of fun.
You don't want to see what's on the other side of the camera.
You do not. Yeah, you absolutely do not. And you don't want to see all the sawdust on my pants either. But
yes.
So we're going to talk about quilting and binding today and show you a bunch of examples. And there are lots of ways to do things. And our way and our approach isn't the only way. We're here to give you ideas. But no rules. You do what works for you. The first question I wanted to get to was Patricia left a question on our Facebook page asking, and I see this a lot, asking for tips on layering and basting that don't involve being on the floor, because some people have mobility issues and they're not comfortable.
A lot of
people, on the floor.
I think a lot of people have issues basting on the floor for two reasons. One is for mobility. It can just be, you may have limitations if that's a challenge for. And others, there are some people who love to pin baste, but they have carpeted floors, and then they're just constantly snagging the carpet. So
if that were the case, I would tell them to put down a tarp on top of the carpet so then they could pin that way. But I would suggest, Patricia, that you think about, if this is something you like to do a lot, figure out some kind of method where you can get your quilt vertical. So if you have an empty wall, or if you have some kind of stretcher, clips, something where you could get things vertically on the wall. It depends too on how big you're talking, because I see sometimes people talk about putting it on a bed, and for me the bed can be very awkward.
It's a strange height.
It's like you have to get on it
and
then sink in. Yeah.
One recommendation.
Too bouncy.
A student of mine had was she cleared off her dining room table and centered the layers on that. And she was someone who did kind of the long basting stitch, and she would baste down the center, move the quilt a bit towards her, baste again, because if I remember right, her dining room table was like too wide to work over, but she could adjust the quilt and actually sit down. If you move all the chairs but one, you can kind of move it along, and that puts it at a more comfortable height. I think that if you have a long dining room table, that's great. But even if you just have a 4 or 5 foot table, you might be able to move it there. That's probably what I would try.
Yeah, I think it sort of depends on how big the quilt is you're talking about. If it's a bed quilt, then I would use the bed, because that's going to be too tall unless you're going to be up on a ladder or something like that.
But one of the suggestions, no matter what it is, no matter, like, vacuum first.
Yes.
It's amazing how if you're draping something, whether it's over a bed or a dining room table, it's going to end up dragging at some point. So it's worth those 10 minutes to vacuum first.
Sure. And you can't vacuum too much. We are vacuuming fanatics at our house, just because we have threads and a dog and allergies and that kind of thing. So that was the first. And yes, Jennifer's reminding us that long armors can baste for you too. And
That's actually a great point, Jennifer.
we love basting on a long arm. And if you have a long armor near you, certainly you can get a price for that, because if mobility is an issue for you, but you like to hand quilt, that is such. Thank you, Jennifer, for reminding us of that.
We've done that.
Yeah, we've done that.
And for people who don't understand that process, what the long armor does is they tend to stretch the backing fabric, and then they just can float the batting on top of that and the quilted top, and they just take long basting stitches, and you can baste a queen size quilt easily in like putting it on, basting it, taking it off in an hour.
Yeah.
And the long armors who do that are like, really, it's a great service.
And it's very efficient.
Very efficient.
Because you can get everything stretched really tautly. So that's a great idea. Okay. And if anybody else has questions about binding and quilting, be sure to let us know. Marty has had a question that I'm going to save for the end, but I'm sorry that I know Terracotta is having a hard time with interruptions. Sometimes it happens. We usually have pretty good coverage here, so it might be on your end, or Facebook, who knows.
So we will, as always, this will be recorded on Facebook, but then if you see me looking up, I have a phone that's also filming it, so I can put it up on YouTube. So if you watch on YouTube and we look like we're looking down,
that's why.
We're looking at the computer. We have two different heights.
We try to pay attention to you both.
Yes.
So, so I want to talk about binding, and we do not do, most of the time, we don't do a traditional binding, but I'm going to show you an example of what I think of as a traditional binding. And that is in our Glyphs quilt from Modern Quilts Illustrated number 9. And that is one where, and you can see I use the same fabric on it, but you can see that there is no machine stitching, there's no top stitching, if you can see that. And so you machine stitch on the front, and then you hand stitch on the back, and you miter at the corners, as you can see. So this is the way.
Didn't you say about 90% of quilters do this?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people feel strongly that you should cut your binding on a bias. We think that unless you have some kind of curved piecing, curved binding, there's like some detail where you have to really go around the corner, that we just cut selvage to selvage for our bindings and put them on grain, not on a bias.
And binding on the bias can be a little more taut. It can follow any curves. We're not against it by any means. We don't do it because it's very inefficient with fabric. When you cut on the bias, you have these big diagonals that you lose.
And I've seen all the hacks for doing it.
There are lots of hacks, but,
yeah.
And a lot of people say that they don't like cutting straight on grain because some people say they don't feel it wears as well. Our experience with wear and bindings is that generally, if a binding begins to fray, we can make a new one.
A new binding.
A new binding.
Yeah.
That we still feel like on grain, the binding lasts plenty long. We have quilts we've used and washed for a decade, and they're absolutely fine. So part of this is a personal preference. Part of it
it's 100% personal preference.
Well,
I
don't think. But I think if you have a curved corner, then you really do, you need to cut on the bias, because if you try to take a straight grain binding, it will not bend.
Yeah. I'm assuming we're talking about,
yes.
Square, rectangular,
okay,
rectilinear quilts. So, but again, if you like to cut on the bias, cut on the bias. If you like to bind edge to, selvage to selvage, do it that way. I've tried the various hacking methods where you fold and refold, and yeah, it was more efficient, but it was more time consuming for me. So we did in the case of this Glyphs quilt, this was very soft colors, and I felt like from a design perspective, I didn't want to have that top stitching on this particular quilt. However, most of the time, and I wanted to just sort of have an example
of standard, traditional
exactly.
binding.
And also, we had this wonderful labyrinth quilting that we did, and I didn't want, it was very loose and soft, and I didn't want the kind of harshness of the top stitch binding that we normally do on this particular quilt.
So this brings up the issue that for us, the way we do our binding always has to do with what is happening with all of the other design elements in the quilt.
Right.
And so we've just pulled up this quilt, and I'll hold this up really close. This is our Whiskers quilt from Magic Inch Quilts. And this uses our top stitched kind of all-in-one binding method. And you see how you do have a visible top stitch. This, what would you say, 95% of our quilts at least, we do this way. And we've done a 2-part video tutorial that's on our YouTube channel on it. But the idea is we basically start with a binding, and I'm going to pretend if this is the quilt and this is the binding, boop, the binding goes over the quilt, and then one row of stitching goes through all the layers and holds it all together. So it's top stitched, you see the top stitching, it is unapologetically machine stitched.
And modern in the sense that you're doing it because it's more durable, and you're acknowledging that you use sewing machines, and that for time or practicality or whatever, that you don't, that hand stitching is not necessary to you. So, and as we have said before, quilt judges have their own philosophy, and they're typically very strong philosophies about what is an acceptable binding. And if you were going to submit something for a competition, I would think twice about using our method, because we don't make quilts for quilt show judges, but many other people do. And if you want to win prizes, there is an expectation that you will hand
finish.
That you won't be able to see. No stitches allowed. The thing is that you're allowed to machine quilt, but you're not allowed to machine bind.
It's a little hypocritical.
Yeah, it's kind of.
We won't get into that, but just be aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
So feel free to send add some questions in the comment section about binding and quilting. And so this quilt also, and we're going to kind of go back and forth between binding and quilting. This quilt is a good example of, and we do not have kits anymore, sorry. This is a great example of a striped binding, and how fun a striped binding can be. You can achieve a striped binding also by making a pieced binding, or using striped fabric, but then you have to cut it selvage to selvage.
And it's one of the interesting
Well, I guess
things.
you would have to, but if you want it, rectilinear.
If you want it to be perpendicular the way we have it, then you do need to cut the fabric on the grain.
Yeah.
If you had a striped fabric for a bias binding, it would be on the diagonal, which can look great too. It's just a different look. You just have to be aware of what you're doing.
Exactly. So actually, I wanted to go back, since we just had this quilt out, and this, back to the glyphs from Modern Quilts Illustrated #9, and this was made with the cherrywood fabrics. They're crazy. They're scrap bags.
They're grab bags.
Grab bags, yes. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was, this is kind of a soft, gentle palette.
Oh, here,
And Actually, let me grab the
issue.
issue so you can see it. We were
So-
actually finding it.
This has dozens of different colors, and Weeks is getting a photo from the magazine of the
So
quilt.
this is the
There it was in
quilt.
progress. We actually, if you look up close, we did something slightly different with this cover. We took a picture as we were binding it.
Exactly. But let me get you the you can see the entire quilt in that image. And then there's a detail here. Oh, here we go. There's the whole quilt. But for me, I felt like this quilt with these colors needed to be free motion quilted in our labyrinth pattern. And actually,
And the labyrinth pattern, which Weeks will show, is basically a series of almost square spirals.
we have a tutorial for it, and this is in issue 9 as well. And this is, you can see that we did what is not what most people would do. Most people would quilt each block individually and change stitching patterns or whatever. We really like the all-over approach to quilting, where the quilting is an overlay over the entire quilt, as opposed to being, look, I quilted this block, I quilted this block, I quilted this block. That it's an additional layer of design that sometimes can reinforce the piecing, but doesn't need to necessarily. But also, let's talk about thread color, because actually, you know what, you can see,
Oh, they're on the back.
you can see the binding, the labyrinth a little bit more on the back. But what we did was chose a matching background color, and it's much darker than the lightest fabrics. There's an example of one of the lighter fabrics. But the thing is that people, when they're thinking about thread colors, and I think this is really paralyzing to a lot of people, they think that the threads are going to be this big on the fabric, and they're not. They're really nervous about not having the thread match every single color.
And if you're not confident, I understand how it can be paralyzing. You're like, how do I pick a thread color if it has to go over green, purple, tan, blue? And we both think like this is why there are so many variegated threads sold, but it's also why we don't recommend them.
Yeah.
They're sold because a lot of times people think, I've got all these colors in my quilt. The variegated thread will have everything, so it will be cohesive. But instead, what happens is the different colors in the variegated thread show up in kind of patchy areas and can actually become distracting. What we do instead is just try to pick, well, we try to remember that your thread is really tiny.
Yeah.
It's not going to be as prominent as you think. It really isn't. So if I'm holding this up now, you can't tell what color the thread is.
No.
I know, like on screen, even for me, 18 inches away, I have to bend in to see that thread color. So it's a lot, like first of all, it's a lot more forgiving than you think.
But I think also, even when you can see it, like look at that purple, you can barely see it. And it's it's practically, a beige on top of this dark purple, and you still really can't see it. So I think thread seems like this really minor thing, but when I've talked to students about this and I start asking questions, here is the train of thought that people tell me, and I probably had this discussion 150 times, and they'll say, but it's not going to match, and I'll say, why does it need to match?
Match.
And they said, because I'm not confident in my quilting. And I said, well, why does it matter whether you're confident in your quilting? I'm worried I'm going to ruin my quilt. And that's kind of, or I'm worried that people are going to think I did a bad job. And that's always where it comes, all the decisions kind of, that seems to be the
Fear is it? Yeah.
the dead end, you know? And that if we can get people past thinking that they need to apologize for their quilting, or thinking that their quilting isn't good enough, or, you know, we're all allowed to be at different stages in our quilting skills, in our quilting development. And if you can catch yourself where you're not thinking all the time, I have to hide my mistakes. They're mistakes, you know, because that gets into that whole perfection thing we've talked about before, that makes quilting more stressful and less fun. So your quilting is fine. Your quilting is like your handwriting. Sometimes it's consistent, sometimes it's not. But you're not worried about signing checks because your penmanship isn't perfect, right? So, you know, if we can kind of back up and figure out why people are so anxious about thread, I think it might help you enjoy the process a little bit more of quilting, that it doesn't have to match.
And I think we're both very much process people, that we want the process to be enjoyable.
Absolutely. Okay, so do we want to talk about...
Let's look at a contrasting binding.
Okay, you want...
Can you get the dress up underneath
Yes.
there? So Weeks was showing first glyphs, which the binding just disappears. And I'll hold this up
And the
again.
quilting kind of disappears too.
Because this quilt is all about the line work in the individual blocks. So we really did not want the binding, to compete. You know, when you hold this up, you don't see the binding as a half inch of color. We wanted everyone's attention to go to the individual blocks. Now, this next quilt that Weeks has, put that there, which is called Dress Up, which is in issue 13?
Yes,
Modern
13.
Quilts Illustrated 13.
Oh, I'll grab that, hold on.
Okay, you grab that. Can I hand
Yeah.
you this to fold? Thank
Yes.
you. So with Dress Up, this quilt has really large pieces. It's really chunky. So look at the edge. The edge of this, sorry, it's always awkward to hold things up on camera. The binding is red. The
Actually,
binding
hold on. I'm gonna
really
just-
stands out.
That's the quilt in issue 13.
So the little sliver of red acts more as an accent, and it's not competing with the design within the quilt. I mean, the smallest, there's one tiny, tiny piece in the quilt, but most of it's really chunky. So we thought this is a case where a contrasting binding actually becomes a nice surprise.
It adds something.
It adds something.
Yeah.
Whereas on the glyphs, it would have actually been distracting if it were contrasting.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the other thing about this is that we matched the thread to the background, and there's some intricate quilting here, and you still don't even see it with practically white thread, and you can still barely see it. So, but the one thing I would say about binding and thread color, and I know people don't want to hear this, but I it's really good advice. I just trust me on this. If you can make your decisions about binding and thread color while you're getting the fabric for the backing and the front, if you make all your design decisions at one time, it will save you so much agony. And I say this as, you know, somebody who has had to make extra trips to a store or wait to finish a quilt because I hadn't thought through the backing. I planned the binding, but then the backing didn't work with the binding. And it's just, the whole process is so much easier if you can plan your binding and backing fabrics and thread color all at the same time. So it's kind of like you're making your own full kit, including the thread,
when you're at the store.
when you're at the store.
And that doesn't work 100% of the
No.
time. Sometimes you're like,
But it's helpful when it does.
I'll make the top, I'll look at my stash and see if I have something that works. I get that. If you have fabric that you want to use, that's absolutely fine. But making all the decisions at once can also help you. Like, if you're at the store and you think, oh, I'm going to be making this quilt and it's going to have big chunks, I can play with the binding.
Yeah.
You might be searching for a binding that would be unlike anything that you'd have in your stash. It gives you an opportunity.
At the very least, get the binding, because you can
least.
because the backing you have a little bit more wiggle room with. But Laura says thanks for the questions about perfection and. Yes, people do stress about their quilts, and I know I have stressed about particular quilts that we've worked on, and I've worried that I'm going to wreck the quilt. There's a couple of quilts.
Let me give an example.
Where I have actually said, "Oh my gosh, I love this quilt so much," and I'm worried. Bill has asked me to quilt it, for example, because I just happen to have he's out of town or whatever, and it's taken me a while to figure out the binding or the back quilting pattern, because I too was stressed out about it.
Can you hand me the billiards quilt on top there? That's it.
Oh yeah.
Right there. This is not just Weeks. It's not just you, Laura. It's all of us.
Oh yes.
So this is a quilt called Billiards, and
Here, let me get it.
if I'm gonna get up close,
wait.
oops.
So it's on the cover of issue 13 of Modern Quilts Illustrated.
But what I'm trying to do is get the light. See if can you see? I don't know if you can see. It's just straight line quilted. Oh my gosh,
Yes.
it's so hard to see.
It is hard to see.
Let me show the back. Can you see there?
Yes.
Okay. It's straight lines. They're equidistant. When I quilted this, I finished one of the lines and I advanced. I was doing it on our long arm and I advanced it and I realized the next one was off by, I'm going to say, somewhere between a 16th and an 1/8 of an inch. So everything looked the exact same spacing. In this one line, I was just mortified. It looked so wrong to me. And I sat there, I turned off the machine, I sat there and I thought, do I rip out all this stitching? And I just thought, no, I'm going to keep going. And I kept going. And when I was done with the quilt, I couldn't even find the mistake anymore. It's just like you said, Laura.
Yeah.
It is so obvious and it causes stress. And so it's good to let go and realize that most of the time you can't see it. And when you can, does it even matter that much?
Well, and in the joke I always have is like, it's not going in the Museum of Us.
Yeah.
Really, this is not one of the world's great crises here.
Yeah.
And it's a quilt, and it's meant to be used, and I'll move on. And I really think of any time we've made mistakes or made something we weren't happy with, it's like, let it go, move on, make something better.
Yeah, what's next? What's next?
But
And-
we need to talk about the binding.
Oh,
on
or
this.
lack thereof.
Yes. So.
Oh, Karen asked if we've ever tied a quilt. Yep. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
so now I don't want to get all the quilt tie lovers all angry, but I'm just going to tell you my little tale of caution. So I want to say about 15 years ago, one of our neighbors came to us and with this tattered quilt. I mean, it had been tied, and there were holes. That it was a beloved blankie. It was a quilt, but it was
a kid's quilt.
Kid's quilt. And the boy was now 8 years old, and he was having his first communion in his Catholic family. And she brought the quilt over, and the areas around where the ties had been had ripped holes in the fabric that were this big.
It was just...
There were parts of the quilt that were just gone. and she had used yarn. I think it was yarn or what do you call it? Embroidery floss to tie it, and the physics. And she tied it maybe every 3 or 4 inches, and the physics were such that the batting had shifted, and because the little boy had played with it and used it so much, the thickness of those ties had just pulled holes, and you could see the ties were still in the batting.
The ties were intact. The ties were much stronger
But you
than
could
the fabric.
you could put your whole hand in the holes. And his mom said, he loves this. It's falling apart, and he's really concerned about this. And so I took the whole thing apart and used spray-based on the back of the original quilt and laminated it to a solid piece of navy blue fabric. A lot of the quilt was navy blue, and requilted it densely.
Just stippled it.
Yeah, just stippled it, kind of like. It's hard to even see the density on the quilting, but like this degree of stippling, and basically any area that was worn and fraying would be just tacked down. And so I like the look of tied quilts.
I actually
But
like.
I saw that, and I have to say it was like PTSD for tying, because I thought it was so beloved, and it was just in tatters.
It goes back to the issue of, do you know how your quilt's going to be used?
Yeah.
I love the physicality of tying. I find it very comforting, but it does allow for so much shift, and often tying is done at corners, and it's usually far apart. So if it's a quilt that's not going to get much wear, you're probably okay. But for a kid's quilt where they're curling up with it, they're dragging it around with them, the chances are pretty high that it's going to tear. Again, because the knots and the ties are so much stronger than any quilting fabric, especially if it's a kid's quilt, it's going to be washed over and over.
Yeah.
And the agitation in the washing machine is a problem. So we're definitely not anti-tie. We're wary about tying.
Well, I think we need to be, the number one thing is you need to be clear about how you're going to care for the quilt. And that is, there are some people, like we had a student, one of our first student in the first class we ever taught, who her whole focus of quilting was on competitions and shows and ribbons and winning stuff. That was her focus. And our focus is on use and having quilts that stand up to washing machines and dryers and kids and dogs and stuff like that. So, we're giving that advice with that in mind.
Yeah.
So, and Joanne says if the quilt has very strong contrasting colors, she recommends gray or gold as a blending thread. And I think the thing is that, to me, it's the question of what is the role of the quilting, is because if you have very strong contrasting colors, sometimes a very strong contrasting thread color, here we go, is actually a good thing as a design element. So this is a contrasting thread for our accordion quilt.
Although, again, on screen it's going to be hard to see.
But it's highly contrasting.
It depends. It is actually it's funny, it's kind of a camely gold, which very similar to what you talked about, but it's one color across many, many solids.
And this is what the quilt looks like. It's finished, and you can't even see it, really.
So Franny, your comment that you have no control, how a gifted quilt will be cared for. No ties.
Oh,
And that goes back.
no control.
So
You know?
it's true. And Laura, your comment that you could make that a decorative element, that you could quilt it and hand tie it. These are all options. You absolutely can think it through.
Oh my gosh! And I just had this flashback, Franny. You have no idea. So, this was maybe 20 years ago. We were in New York, and Real Simple magazine said that they wanted to include one of our quilts in one of their issues, and we thought, oh, and they saw the prices of them and the quality and everything, and we thought, oh, how lovely. And we got the quilt back, and it was filthy.
Yeah, we sent it to them for a photo shoot.
We kind of joked, like, did they drag it through the dirt? And then the magazine comes out, and they've put it down our quilt in the middle of an apple orchard.
It's a picnic blanket.
It's a picnic blanket. And I was just
clearly
like,
everyone was standing on it during the photo shoot.
Yeah, standing on it.
And this is where we were glad that it was
Yeah.
densely quilted. We just tossed it in the machine. It was fine, but it was, I will say,
it was a little. It damaged my feelings about Real Simple magazine.
Magazines. We've probably been 60 magazines or something, and they're generally really careful. They were not.
Yeah, that one, no. So you are so right. You have no control over how even a loaned quilt will be cared for. So, at any rate, so.
You want to go back to the.
Oh, and Laura was suggesting if you like the look of hand tying at it. Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it too. Oh, so we wanted to
going
talk
back.
about,
See, we're getting off track as we often do, but this quilt.
No, we're not talking about politics or something.
So this is a detail of the billiards quilt, which we showed you earlier. And do you see where her hand is?
That tip.
Tip.
We were really worried about how to bind this quilt when we were designing it, and I said, well, we have a thing, love it for 5 minutes, which means, like, don't reject the idea until you've given it a little bit of thought. And I said, I don't want a binding near that, and I don't want to design the pattern in such a way that you have a binding at the end of that tip. I think we should do the French pillowcase binding technique. And Bill said, that doesn't work for big quilts. And I said, we need to develop a new technique.
And so we did. And I loved it for 5 minutes and ended up loving it for a lot longer because the technique worked so well. We documented it in the magazine. But having no binding using this French pillowcase technique allows us to have that really precise point, which is such an important part of the whole quilt.
Yeah.
And if we had had a 1/2 inch traditional binding over that, it would have truncated the beautiful geometry. And this is a quilt that they're large, simple shapes, but it's all about the precision. And that would be lost if we hadn't paid attention to that. So she developed a different way of basically spray basting and layering a large quilt as a French pillowcase binding technique with the French pillowcase binding technique, and it worked great.
And we never imagined that this would be on a postage stamp in Japan.
Oh yeah. This quilt ended up being on a postage stamp in Japan, which was wild.
Yeah. So I also want to talk about contrasting. This is a different approach.
I'm getting buried. I'm gonna
different
fold.
Approach to contrasting in terms of scale too, because a lot of you, this is our Sunshine quilt, and this is a standalone pattern on our website, but it's made with a very vibrant K-facet patterned fabrics, and yet it's often a challenge as to how you choose a binding when all these fabrics are so large scale they don't look so great when they're cut up to a 1/2 inch binding. So we used actually one of our fabrics. I think this is from Lavish.
And the Galaxy print.
Was the Galaxy print? Yeah, yeah. It's right
Here's
behind you.
Lavish.
Yeah. But you can see the scale is very different. The scale of the print is so much different than the scale. Like here's an example of the huge prints that are in the quilt itself, and that's one of our fabrics on the back. But having a small scale for a binding with large scale prints in it is very, very helpful, especially if you're somebody who doesn't do borders,
Well,
for fabrics like this.
it gives you a continuous edge, because if we took, say, this large scale fabric and made a binding out of it, you get 2 inches of orange, 2 inches of purple, an inch of yellow, and when it butted up against other fabrics, it may look like a whole, what we always call the mouse nibble problem.
You just can't see what it is.
You can't see what it is.
Yeah.
And whereas by using this small scale blue, kind of a periwinkle, that really wasn't in, a color that wasn't really in the other fabrics, it would never blend into the fabric. No matter where it was along the length of the quilt, you would see it.
Right.
Whether it was binding a pink, a yellow, an orange. And so that idea of continuity is important. So when you're auditioning fabrics for bindings in the quilt shop, if you're going to use a 1/2 inch binding, always look at what that fabric looks like as a 1/2 inch. Quilters always talk about, when you're picking the thread color, don't look at the spool, look at the single strand of thread. Same thing for quilting. When you're picking, binding. When you're picking a binding fabric, don't look at the whole bolt, look at a 1/2 inch sliver.
Yes, and Paulette wants to know, is the blue binding sewed on both sides? So Paulette, we do our binding technique, which you can see on our YouTube channel. It's an all-in-one. It's sewed on the front and back at the same time.
Just straight through.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of people who are fans of faced bindings, and I don't like the way they look on the back, where there's usually a big flange. And if you like it, and that's your favorite technique, by all means do it. The sometimes the edge of the quilt can you're putting a binding on it that is going to be like the weakest part of the quilt.
There's an odd stress point.
Yeah, and then if you've got a hand sew it on the back anyway, but if it's a wall hanging and that's the best solution for you, feel free to do it.
But in this case, instead of a traditional binding where it's machine sewn, flipped, and then hand sewn, this is just machine sewn all the way through. And again, we talk about this a lot. Almost all the quilts we show are made this way. We make the binding using, if I could only have one tool other than the rotary cutter, it would probably be the Clover 1-inch binding tool. It's a 25 millimeter binding tool, and what that does is you can pass a 2-inch strip of fabric through it and press it into a 1/2 inch finished binding. And once I've made the binding using the top stitching method, I'll generally quilt a queen size quilt in about 45 minutes, or bind, a queen size quilt in about 45 minutes. So it's not that I'm in a hurry. I've talked to plenty of people who love the hand finishing of a binding and find it very meditative. Then by all means do that. It's not what I love. So I would rather finish it in a practical way that I do like, and then have time to do something else. So, you've got to figure out where the pleasure is in the process and make the most of that. We get emails from customers begging us to make kits where all the pieces are pre-cut. Mm-hmm. And we don't do that. And
We'd go bankrupt if we did.
Yeah, we'd go bankrupt. Or else we'd say, like, no one would be able to afford the kits.
Yeah.
They'd be so expensive. But there are people who say, like, I just hate cutting. And
Or they
that's
can't cut.
also why the systems like the AccuQuilt cutting system can be really helpful, whether you don't like to cut or whether you have arthritis that makes it challenging. There are different approaches. So same thing with binding. Find the technique that fits your time, your skill level, and your design aesthetic.
And I also saw somebody made a comment about, I feel like sending my quilts out is cheating. And cheating who? Who are you cheating? So, I really think we need to focus on the fact that this is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be relaxing, and that nobody's cheating anybody by using any technique or method or whatever that works for them. So if you want to do hand binding, do hand binding. If you want to do facing, do facing. If you want to do it on the bias, do it on the bias.
If you want to pay someone to do it for you, pay someone.
Absolutely. There's no cheating.
Someone will be happy to have that paycheck. And
yeah, absolutely.
if it lets you piece more quilts and that's where you get your pleasure, by all means do that. We're all about just encouraging people to make things
and enjoy
that process.
And I promise you, there's no, at the gates of heaven, nobody will be asking whether some long armor did your quilt or not. I also wanted to show this quilt, which is our Cool Yule quilt,
which has a whole series of these trees.
Yes, and this is a standalone pattern on digital download on our.
We have it up, don't we? I think
Yes, we do.
I'm just like,
yes.
We told you at the beginning of the hour, we've been doing all these repairs, so we're both a little tired.
It's been quite the year. And Karen says she loves our binding technique. Thank you, Karen. I'm glad. I'm glad it's helpful.
And thanks to Clover too.
Yes.
Because these are such great tools.
They really are. We used a little mini plaid for the binding for this. So again, don't rule out plaids as being binding options for you. And I also want to talk about, like, you can see how dark this teal is. It's quilted with white thread. So this is...
You would never guess it.
You can't even really see it.
Oh, it's light gray.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
On the back, that's what it looks like on a blue and white plaid. So the thread, and we use signature 100% cotton thread, which is actually thicker than Aurifil or one of those threads. So we're not even using the thinnest thread that's out there. So when you are worried about something, and we did that because, hold on. Do you see the white plaids and stripes and ginghams and stuff on the trees? We wanted them to not look heavy. So we felt that
a very light
light, almost white gray thread was going to look better. And let's see if you can get close. And you can see.
And for those of you watching later on YouTube, sorry, that camera's farther away.
Yes. But you can see it doesn't show at all. So the concern that people have about their quilting showing too much is typically unfounded.
Yeah, it's a little overblown, the concern. Yeah. And it's a good concern to have. It's a good question to ask yourself. But I think there's more fear of it being not looking good. If you want, you can always just cut a little 4-inch square and do a test piece.
Absolutely. And
just see what it looks like, because it is hard to visualize what thread looks like until you see it.
Now, I also want to talk about this. Can you hold up that edge a little bit down there so they can see? The design of this is, you got it?
Yeah.
The design of this, can you hold it up a little higher, is that so graphic with these big trees. And although there is all of this negative space, we didn't want to have a lot of really fussy quilting in here. So this is what we call an elongated stipple. And can you move a little closer? Maybe you can see it. It's basically if you took a standard stipple and then you just pulled it horizontally. And so the goal in choosing this stitching pattern, and this is all free motion, is to look at the horizontal lines of the Christmas trees here and reflect that horizontal direction without it being straight. So it's kind of a soft free motion pattern on top of this very chunky graphic trees.
But it maintains the horizontality.
Right.
And
So
I do want to also talk about up close this plaid binding. Some people get nervous because they say it's not going to be straight.
yes.
And if you look closely, it's not perfectly
Yes.
straight. No one's dying here. It may run slightly diagonally, especially because
It doesn't matter to us. There are people to whom it would really matter. And Meg, if you would like me to show you how to install flooring,
she's good.
because as we said at the beginning of the hour, we had this leak in our studio that we've been dealing with for several months. We couldn't find a contractor. So
I found a contractor.
So I decided, as we have many times this year, when we have not been able to find a contractor for some reason because of the labor issue right now, I'm going to watch some YouTube tutorials and I'm getting my tools and I'm doing it. So
And the funny thing
yes.
is, I was
So we've been installing flooring for the last 24
I was
hours.
at the university this morning teaching, and Weeks texts me a photo of her progress, which included like our big long arm, which is on wheels. She's laid down enough flooring that she's wheeled the whole long arm into the other part of the studio, and it's over
Yes.
the flooring she has laid. So it was impressive progress.
So, you know, I just got tired of being blown off, and I'm like, in this time I'm spending chasing people down, I could just learn how to install flooring.
Yes.
So yes, now I've added that to my my resume.
The resume is getting longer than we wish.
But it's funny because last night we came to, like, there's this clean out valve that's a circular PVC pipe, and I had to put underlayment over this, and I thought, this is so, I am so good at cutting the curve all the way around the catch basin.
So,
valve.
you know, we had shown you these bindings made with the Clover tool. I did want to show that we sell this one on our website, but Clover makes them in a couple other sizes. This is the monster. Like, this is our regular one. This is the big daddy.
Actually, show the mouth, because that's a better
It's huge.
way to see it.
And you might ask yourself, what would you use this for? We've actually made very thick bindings on occasion, chunky, for some quilts we've made that were just winter curl-up cozy, where they were backed with Berber fleece that's so thick that in order to wrap a binding around it, you need so much more play. So that's great for a chunky fleece quilt. And then the opposite, if this is the regular, is the teeny tiny one that does, what is this, 1/4 inch finished binding. This is generally sold for hemming doll clothes
Or applique.
and applique, but
want me to get
someone,
that?
do you have it there?
Yeah.
I use this,
Don't ask us for the pattern though.
at some point maybe we'll give it, but
At some point.
we did this for a Japanese magazine. This was a little wintry
Handwork.
applique handwork piece, but that's a tiny 1/4 inch finished binding where we wanted it to be very delicate.
Yeah. So I want to just show one other. This is our vine quilt. Here, let me get this one out of the way. Our vine quilt from issue 14, right?
Yes.
And I wanted to show how you can combine prints and yarn dyes in the binding and the backing. So we used our little domino motif fabric for the binding, and then we used a yarn dye on the back. So don't feel like if you choose a print for the binding or a yarn dye for the binding that you have to have the exact same
mix and
fabric.
match.
Yep. And this is our very simple, quick wave pattern, which is the pattern that we recommend for anybody who's doing, who's not confident in their quilting and they just want to get it done quickly and easily.
And may have problems with, or isn't confident in their stippling yet. An irregular wave pattern, what's so nice about it is, if you're working on a domestic machine, it really wants to sew in long lines, and doing them slightly irregularly is a forgiving way to do it, as long as you don't go all crazy crooked, like kind of chalk some lines to stay generally straight.
And if you're using a domestic machine, use a walking foot to keep all of your layers together. Yeah. So
basically, I think that kind of captures a little bit about bindings and quilting that we're thinking of. We are so looking forward to getting the studio back together. So we've got a lot of half-finished projects around right now that we'll be sharing with you when they are finished projects.
Well, because we literally can't sew until we get everything put back in one piece. But let us know what other topics. We have one more Quilts First this year. Let us know other topics you'd like us to discuss.
Other than installing flooring.
That's going to be in the rearview mirror by then. We're going to be done.
Yes.
It's going to be nothing but a bad memory. So thanks for joining us today. And again, leave your comments below for other things you'd like us to talk about. And we hope that everybody is safe and healthy and getting ready for the holidays and some family time at the end of the year.